Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, our American memory of the Battle of Gettysburg is typically focused on July 2nd along Little Round Top, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine holding their part of the line, the action at Devil's Den as the orange blossoms of the 124th New York were overrun by Confederates and made their way up Little Round Top for that attack. And then, of course, Pickett's charge on July 3rd, the failed Confederate attack, General Lee riding among his men after the attack was over, apologizing and taking responsibility for the orders he gave. We don't think about Culp's Hill on the other side of the battlefield, and yet some of the dramatic activity that happened there is some of the most horrific fighting of the entire battle on July 2nd and July 3rd. While I was researching the 2nd Maryland Infantry, the Confederate 2nd Maryland, I came across this soldier here, Major Benjamin W. Lee, and became really interested in his story. And I found two primary source accounts of his death at Culp's Hill. And before I share them with you, let me tell you just a little bit about him so you can get a sense of his connection to Virginia, his home state, and the Army of Northern Virginia, including a connection to Stonewall Jackson. So Lee was a wealthy businessman in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. According to the 1860 census slave schedules, he enslaved 34 people. When the war began, he raised a company for the 1st Battalion of Virginia Infantry. A year later, promoted acting colonel of the 42nd Virginia Infantry. And then a couple months after that, in early 1863, he's promoted to major and assigned to be an adjutant on the staff of General A.P. Hill. On May 2nd, 1863, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee happens to be riding with General Stonewall Jackson. When friendly fire hits Jackson, Lee, in this moment, he scrambles to find a surgeon to take care of Jackson, and then he helps carry Jackson out of harm's way to safety so that Jackson could be treated. Of course, Jackson ultimately dies. He succumbs to the wound and pneumonia. And then after that, in June of 1863, just weeks after Jackson's death, Lee is reassigned to another staff, and that's General Edward Johnson. He commands a division in the Corps of Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell. Now, that brings us up to Gettysburg and Culp's Hill and the two accounts that I mentioned. They are vivid accounts, and they're both Union accounts. And so they're coming to you and to me and to history through the eyes of the victors. And so let me begin with a short passage that comes from an after action report from Brigadier General John White Giri. He's a division commander in the Union 12th Corps, and he's talking about the last charge by the Confederates around 10 or 10:30 in the morning on July 3rd, while the bombardment is going on before Pickett's charge on the other side of the battlefield. So here's what Giri has to say that's relevant to Major Lee. Giri says, quote, "This was the last charge. As they, the Confederates, fell back, our troops rushed forward with wild cheers of victory, driving the rebels in confusion over the entrenchments, the ground being covered with their dead and wounded. Large numbers of them crawled under our breastworks and begged to be taken as prisoners. Among these were many of the celebrated Stonewall Brigade, who, when ordered for the last time to charge upon Brigadier General George S. Greene's breastworks, advanced until met by our terrible fire, and then, throwing down their arms, rushed in with white flags, handkerchiefs, and even pieces of paper in preference to meeting again that fire which was certain destruction. As they threw themselves forward and crouched under our line of fire, they begged our men to spare them, and they were permitted to come into our lines. The commanding officer of one regiment raised the white flag when Major B.W. Lee, Assistant Adjutant General of Johnson's division, rode forward to order it down and fell, pierced by a dozen balls, his body remaining in our possession. This final charge, made at 10:30 a.m., which was so eminently successful to us, resulted in the rout of the enemy, terminating the attempt to turn our position and gain the Baltimore Turnpike. So there you have an account of Lee's death, hit by a dozen mini bullets. How Giri knew it was a dozen, I don't know, but we can assume that a volley is fired at Lee and it brings him down. Now, on to the second account. This is by Samuel P. Bates, a respected historian, has authored a number of books about the Civil War, known for interviewing many soldiers. And so his account of Culp's Hill, which mentions Lee's death, is really vivid. It's really dramatic. It comes from someone who's a writer. And so one mistake here is that he refers to Major Lee as Major Light, L-I-G-H-T. So the passage I'm going to read to you, I've changed it so that it is correct. So listen to this. Quote, "But what a field was this! For 3 hours of the previous evening and 7 of the morning had the most terrible elements of destruction known to modern warfare been wielded with a might and a dexterity rarely, if ever, paralleled. The wood in which the battle had been fought was torn and rent with shells and solid shot, and pierced with innumerable mini balls. Trees were broken off and splintered, and that entire forest where the battle raged most furiously was, on the following year, leafless, the stately but mute occupants having yielded up their lives with those whom they overshadowed. The ground, as it presented itself when the battle was over, bore a mournful spectacle. We awoke early on the 5th, says a soldier above quoted, as we had done on the 3 preceding mornings, and discovered that the foe had disappeared from our front. A number of us immediately sprang over the breastworks and descended the hill towards the creek. Before advancing many paces, we came upon numberless forms, clad either in gray, stark and stiff, or else still weltering in their blood. It was the most sickening and horrible sight I had yet witnessed. Many of the dead bodies had lain here for 24 hours and had turned to a purplish black, being greatly distended and emitting a horrible stench. Turning whichever way we chose, the eye rested upon human forms, lying in all imaginable positions, some upon their backs, others upon their faces, and others still upon their knees, the body supported against a rock. Not a few were killed while in readiness to discharge their pieces, the body still in position. Some of them had erected a slight protection of stone against the front and right flank fire, yet the fatal bullet reached them even there. We were surprised at the accuracy as well as the bloody results of our fire. It was indeed dreadful to witness. Farther down the hill, we found Major Lee, Assistant Adjutant General on Ewell's staff, dead, as well as his horse, which lay partly upon him. One of the rebel wounded informed us that he had been killed while superintending one of the advances made against us during the night. We turned from the sickening spectacle of the dead to the wounded, of whom there were many, all helpless, those who could be, having already been removed. To these, we gave the contents of our canteens. Their haversacks were better filled than our own, for they had good bacon and pork, which they had foraged from the farmers of the Cumberland Valley. So you notice a couple of different conflicting details in these accounts, where White in his after action report, or pardon me, Giri in his after action report notes that Lee had been ordering down a surrender flag. Bates notes that Lee may have been directing maneuvers on the night before. Based on research, other research that I've read, the account by John White Geary is actually the correct one, where Major Lee was trying to stop a flag, a surrender flag, from being raised. So there you have a little bit of the flavor of Culp's Hill, which, of course, as I mentioned, is just not as well discussed as the other side of the battlefield of Gettysburg. And within the Battle of Culp's Hill, those two horrific days of fighting, you've got the story of Major Benjamin Lee, who made the ultimate sacrifice on the slope of Culp's Hill. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.